Howdy, students. Welcome to Chapter 13. We are definitely on a downhill part of the course, and it's time to start wrapping things up. At this point, you actually know everything you need to know to come up with an effective policy, and in Chapter 14, we'll do just that. But in this chapter, we'll talk about the history of climate science and policy and use that to figure out where we are and how we got here. After all, you might be wondering, given the strength of the science that we've learned this semester, why are we not doing anything about this? To begin, realize that for most of human history, climate change wasn't a thing. People obviously recognized the seasons, and they understood that some years were hotter than others, but climate generally changes so slowly that any individual's climate is very close to their parents' climate, which was close to their parents' parents or their parents' 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 climate. So people had no reason to even consider whether the climate could change. This all ended in the 1830s. At that time, scientists in Europe recognized geological evidence that the region had, at some point in the past, been covered with ice. For example, this boulder is known as the Old Swede, and it sits on the banks of the Elbe in Hamburg, Germany. If you look around, there's no obvious place it could have come from. And if you do an analysis of the composition of the rock, you can determine that it came from Sweden, hence the name, which is hundreds of miles away. Glaciers are one of the few things that can explain how a Swedish boulder gets to Germany. Glaciers scour the surface and break off rock and other debris, and as the glacier flows, the debris can be transported vast distances. Along with other evidence, it became very clear that the Earth had previously experienced widespread ice ages. For the next century, much of the research on climate change was focused on understanding this. Around the same time, mathematician Joseph Fourier was laying the groundwork of climate science. He worked out in the 1820s the basic physics of Chapter 4, how the planet was being warmed by the atmosphere. This was the birth of the greenhouse effect. He did not, however, know what constituents of the atmosphere were absorbing infrared radiation. That would come about 30 years later when British scientist John Tyndall identified that water vapor and carbon dioxide were the gases in the atmosphere that were responsible for absorbing infrared radiation. About 40 years after Tyndall, Svante Arrhenius, a Nobel Prize-winning physical chemist, put everything together. He took the physics that Fourier identified and Tyndall's work identifying water vapor and CO2 as the most important absorbers of radiation and put everything together to conclude that if we doubled carbon dioxide, the planet would warm between 5 and 6 degrees Celsius, about a factor of 2 larger than the modern value we talked about in Chapter 6. Given what was understood at the time, this was a titanic scientific achievement. Let me emphasize this. Much of the science of climate change was worked out by the end of the 19th century. We've learned a lot of things since then, and our confidence in our understanding is much higher now. But nothing we have learned has contradicted Arrhenius's view of the climate system. To me, the stability of our understanding of the climate system and the fact that everything we learned just confirms what we previously thought was true is one of the reasons that I personally have such high confidence in climate science. Getting back to Arrhenius, he also understood that humans were adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by burning coal, and that this would lead to a warming climate. However, he did not realize how fast we were doing it because he did not recognize that emissions were going up exponentially. He thought it would take 1,000 years to double the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. In reality, we may do it in 2 centuries. It's also worth noting that Arrhenius was not particularly concerned about climate change. Our concern for the environment is really only a few decades old. Before that time, people felt they were locked in a battle of survival with nature. If the rains failed, they would starve. If wolves took their livestock, they would go bankrupt. If it was a cold year, they would freeze. Nature was a killer. As Grimm's fairy tales told you, kids that wandered into the forest didn't always come back. And any Jack London story makes clear that the battle between humans and nature was a close fight, and you never knew who would win. There's something wrong with that. Okay, that's much better. It would take about 50 more years for people to view nature as something to be protected rather than something to conquer. More on that in the next video. And now, your moment of dog.
Go get it, Tiger.